Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren Cass. I'm the chief economist here at American Compass. And today we are trying something a little bit new here for the podcast. We have a recording of a live debate that I participated in on December 9th in New York City with former Senator Phil Gramm. Senator Gramm, of course, is an important leader in the Republican Party for a long time and writes frequently for the Wall Street Journal. Great proponent of free markets, of free trade. And so we had a really interesting discussion on what has been going on with economics in the United States, what the problems are in the industrial economy in particular, and what that means for free trade and tariffs, and many of those issues that are now coming into focus with the incoming administration. So I think it presented a very good distillation of many of the conflicts going on, certainly within the Republican Party, within the conservative movement. Apologies in advance for a few spots where the audio may go in and out a bit, as we were counting on everyone to hold microphones close to their mouths throughout. But I think a really good opportunity to bring a discussion to a much wider audience than we could fit in a room at the Harvard Club. So thank you again to Senator Gramm for participating, to Terry Keeley, who you'll hear was moderating the discussion and helped bring it together, and hope you find that interesting. Before we get to it, of course, have to tell you what else is going on at American Compass. Most notably, you'll have seen we've announced the forthcoming launch of Commonplace, a new magazine that we will have up and running in January. It will take over and inherit all of the great work and writers we've been featuring at the Commons in recent months. So you can go and sign up to receive updates and must-reads at commonplace.org. You can follow us on X at CommonPLC, and much more to come on that. In the meantime, the Commons is still running full steam. Great pieces this week from Patrick Brown on child tax credit and the TCJA fight, and from Aaron Wren on the two-tier justice system and what that means in our financial institutions. So take a look at those pieces. And of course, Understanding America, always exciting, always fresh, except of course over the holidays when we'll be on brief hiatus, but some great stuff out this week. So hopefully it is hitting your inbox. If not, head over to understandingamerica.co to sign up. And now, without further ado, my conversation on trade and tariffs with Senator Phil Gramm.
Okay, dear friends, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for making time on a Monday morning for a very consequential conversation. So today's conversation is not a debate. It's a conversation about tariffs, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And what I thought I'd do, if it's okay with you, Oren, Phil, is start with a few questions of my own, and then we're going to come to the room and ask all you to contribute. So I'm going to start, if that's okay, Senator, with you. In 1979, 20 million Americans worked in manufacturing, and that's in a population of 225 million. Today, 13 million Americans work in manufacturing, and that's in a population of 335 million. So manufacturing jobs are down 35%, while the population is up 50%. And in a recent article that Oren wrote, Does Trade Policy Affect Trade? Oren wrote, quote, "The blind embrace of free trade with an aggressively mercantilist China yielded a deeply damaging deindustrialization in the United States." The data really seems to bear out Oren's observation there about a deeply damaging deindustrialization. Do you think he's wrong?
Yes, I do. And let me explain why. First of all, let me start with agriculture. At the beginning of the 20th century, you had about 40% of Americans who worked in agriculture. And by the end of the century, 1.5% worked in agriculture. Where did all our ag jobs go? Were we de-agricultured? No, what happened is we had a massive expansion in technological know-how. We produced far more goods with 1.5% of our workers in agriculture than we ever produced when more than 40% of them were in agriculture. And Does anybody want to go back to the farm? Yeah, rich people want to live on farms and ranches, but as I do, but I don't farm and I don't ranch. I just have wildlife. So we are in manufacturing in a very similar position. In 1944, the percentage of Americans in manufacturing peaked, and it had declined to about 25% by 1975, and it's now down to 8%. Were we deindustrialized? We today produce 2.5 times more agricultural products in value terms with 8% of the labor force than we produced in 1975 with 25% of the labor force. In fact, the percentage of workers in manufacturing has declined more or less consistently since 1944. And by all outward and visible signs, that is not about to change. Now, let me talk about China. First of all, China came into the WTO effectively on January the 1st of 2002. Now, if China had produced a massive collapse in employment and in industrial production, we would think that from 1975, the beginning of the post-war era, until 2002, that the rate of growth in that period, or the rate of decline in manufacturing as a percentage of total employment, would be smaller than has occurred since 2002 if, in fact, China was taking away American manufacturing jobs. The facts don't bear it out. Actually, the rate of decline in U.S. manufacturing since China joined the WTO has declined. Now, there have been studies. You had a study on the China shock. Is that what it was called? I think so. They looked at a very small group of industries that were most affected by China entering the WTO. But if you look at the economy as a whole, there is no evidence to substantiate the claim that China's entrance into the WTO has basically deindustrialized America. The same argument, and I'll quit, Terry, is made on NAFTA. And it is the weakest argument that has ever been made economically related to trade. And by the way, when China came into the WTO, they cut their average tariff from over 15% to under 5%. We did not reduce our tariffs when China entered the WTO. When NAFTA started, Mexico cut their tariffs 3 times as much as we did. Canada cut their tariffs twice as much as we did. The same is true when you look at the trend of the fall in employment in manufacturing as compared to the total level of employment. The same is true for NAFTA. It actually, the decline in employment in manufacturing relative to total employment actually lessened after NAFTA. The period following NAFTA was one of the 2 most prosperous periods in post-war America. This was during the Clinton boom. And so there is no evidence of any giant sucking sound that sent our jobs to Mexico. So where did this claim come from? It came from the fact that NAFTA was good for Mexico, that jobs were created in Mexico. And the logic being, well, if jobs were created in Mexico, they must have come from America. Well, this is sort of a narrow view of single entry bookkeeping, that if somebody gains from trade, somebody else had to lose from trade. And if you listen to the president very closely, his basic view is if he sells you something, he wins. If he buys something from you, he loses. Well, that's an absurd view of the world. And so, yeah, there's no doubt about the fact if you were producing certain items, you were affected by trade with Mexico, you were affected by trade with China. But was the country made worse off? The answer is clearly no.
I'm sure, Oren, you want to respond. The senator makes valid claims about rising productivity across the agriculture and manufacturing sector, but I suspect you think he's leaving a few things out.
I do. Thank you, ever, for coming, Senator, for doing this. I think it's a very important conversation. And I guess it's always difficult if we sort of get into a data fight and we don't have the charts. So I want to sort of make, hopefully, what are a few useful conceptual distinctions. One is between the percentage of employment in manufacturing versus the actual level of employment in manufacturing and the level of output from manufacturing. I think we are in complete agreement that manufacturing as a share of employment has been declining, will inevitably decline in any economy as it develops. That is good and natural and speaks to rising prosperity in a lot of ways. But there's a reason that he quickly switched from your question about number of jobs to a discussion about percentage of jobs. And that's because if you look at the number of jobs, if you look at what has happened to the productivity of those jobs, the positive story falls apart. So it is not only true that there were sort of 18 to 20 million manufacturing jobs in the US in the 1970s, it's also true that that's how many manufacturing jobs there were in the 1940s, and it's true that that's how many manufacturing jobs there were in the year 2000. How did that happen, despite the incredible rising productivity? It's because in a healthy manufacturing sector, what you want to see is rising productivity, and with it, rising output. Let's think about, sort of go down to the microcosm of a single widget factory. You double the productivity, they can make 20,000 widgets instead of 10,000. Two different things could happen. You could lay off half the workers, or you could make twice as many widgets. The history of American manufacturing up until the year 2000 was that we made twice as many widgets. And so with productivity rising, but that meaning more output, more jobs, comparable jobs, higher productivity jobs, higher wages, absolutely that led to the creation of more service jobs. That meant manufacturing employment wasn't continuing to grow, but it also meant that that very healthy, robust, competitive industrial sector could anchor local communities, could drive innovation more broadly, and could support all of the reasons we care about manufacturing, including our national security. What happened almost instantly in that period that the senator spoke about, 2000 to 2002, after we admitted to China to the WTO, is that the equation flipped. We took the factories that had been operating with more investment, more productivity in the United States, and we simply shut down a huge number of them. All of that decline you talked about happened in a single decade. We went from, all the way down, in fact, to 11 million jobs. And that was not a result of rising productivity. That was not a result of the same sort of wondrous progress we've seen in agriculture. That was a result of simply saying things we used to make here, China will now make instead. And it's very important to keep in mind how this was sold to the American people. The pitch of globalization and what you learn in Econ 101 is comparative advantage. We are going to specialize in the things we can do best. China is going to specialize in things they can do best. You can go back, Robert Solow gave an incredibly condescending press conference at the White House in 2000, explaining, of course, we will lose some low-wage jobs, but we will get better high-wage jobs, and we will be the winners. When China joined the WTO, we had a surplus in advanced technology products, as you would expect being the United States. We now run more than a $200 billion deficit in advanced technology products. So it's not that we did the comparative advantage thing. We simply lost everything. And in fact, our trade deficit now exceeds $1 trillion, which means not they're making some things, we're making others, and we trade them. It means the things we used to make, we just don't make anymore, and we didn't get to make anything else instead. In fact, we're buying those goods on credit. The last point I want to make in two parts is just what this actually does to the American economy more broadly over time. So the loss of those 6 to 8 million manufacturing jobs, the decimation of communities across the country, the surge in deaths of despair, that everybody is familiar with at this point. A lot of people don't know our rate of deaths from drug overdoses in this country is now comparable to the rate from alcohol abuse in the decade after the Soviet Union fell in Russia. That's how our country's doing right now. But economically, I would highlight two things for you. One, output actually stopped growing. Okay, we actually now produce the same or less, depending on how you measure it, in American factories than we did in 2007. With the best measure, I'd say we are back down to a mid-1990s level. That's not percentage of the economy, that's absolute terms, despite all the population growth, despite the economic growth. And with that, you see we can't make advanced semiconductors anymore. We're having to launch federal policy to try to bring it back. Our aerospace industry cannot compete with the European state-run aerospace industry. We cannot compete with China on batteries and electric vehicles. All of this is the consequence of saying we're just going to lose our capacity to innovate and invest in manufacturing. And then the last point, the real kicker, productivity isn't growing in manufacturing anymore. Productivity has actually fallen in the manufacturing sector since 2012. People are squinting at me. This is a fun one to tell people because they say, no, that you must understand, you must mean employment. I say, no, I mean productivity. They say, no, you must be getting your derivatives mixed up. You must mean productivity is not growing as fast as it used to. Nope. I did this is especially fun, I did this to the former head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. He didn't know. Because how can that possibly be true? We literally need more labor in our factories produce the same output as a decade ago. And so the reason that number on your sheet is back up to 13 million from 11 million isn't because of some re-strengthening. It's because our sector has become so weak, so far behind the curve, that we are literally becoming less able to make things at this point. And that is a fallout that we are experiencing across our economy and ultimately in our ability even to defend the country. And so that's why these sorts of stories about the wonders of agriculture 100 years ago, I think, are simply not relevant to what we are facing.
Well, let me respond.
This is not a debate.
I understand that.
I would like to know for the record that I was hoping it would be a debate.
Productivity did reach a maximum in 2018, the year that Trump imposed protective tariffs. Productivity suffered. Industrial production, let me start over. Productivity reached a peak in 2011 when Obama imposed a massive regulatory burden on the American economy. Productivity grew in 2018 as the deregulatory program of Trump went into effect and as the tax cuts went into effect. But when the tariffs went into effect, productivity declined. And this productivity decline is not just in manufacturing. This is an economy-wide phenomenon. And this idea that we're producing less, Americans are consuming more and more services. And there's one big piece left out of all this. The Bureau of Labor Statistics decided in the year 2000 to classify programming as a service instead of manufacturing. So that today, when you produce an automobile, all the gadgets on it are not counted as manufacturing, even though in some cases 50% of the value is in those gadgets. And when Oren is saying, well, we don't produce anything, what did you ever hear of the giant tech companies? They're producing something. We dominate the world in technology.
What are they producing?
They're producing programming, they're producing design, and we are earning more in those areas than is being earned by actually producing phones. Also, when you're talking about what has happened to productivity, one of the big problems with productivity is measuring it. On this phone, I've got more information than is in the local public library. This phone has changed my world. I can work at home on this phone and get instantly in touch with anybody in the world. Where is that in the Consumer Price Index? Where is that in productivity? The answer, nowhere.
I do think
we are not measuring quality in products that are being produced, and these phenomena are worldwide.
So Oren's going to respond, okay, Senator, and then I'm going to ask Oren a question.
Well, there's a general rule that whoever pulls their iPhone out first to make a point is not doing well. So I feel good about that.
What did I do?
He said you're brilliant.
Yes, that is also true.
Well, we know he's lying now.
The story that the senator just tried to tell about productivity starting to slow down because of something Barack Obama did in 2011, and then it started going up in 2018 because of the good thing we liked about Donald Trump, but then also started going down in 2018 because of the bad thing we didn't like about Donald Trump, is exactly the sort of reverse engineered attempts at explaining reality that you get when reality is just not aligning with the actual economic theory. And I think it's important to note that it is not true that productivity is down overall. If productivity were down overall, what would be happening to GDP? Productivity in all of the things that you were just saying is difficult to measure is in fact up. The one place productivity is down is in the thing we can darn well measure, which is how much stuff is coming out of factories compared to how many people are working in the factories. So I am very open to the sort of conceptual debate about what exactly has caused these things and what we can do about it. But I do think we need to stay focused on the reality that these things have happened, and that even when we get to this question of, okay, well, what are we still making versus what aren't we, our big tech companies no longer produce in this country. And this is something that Andy Grove, the famed, incredible CEO of Intel, when Intel was an incredible company.
A long time ago,
warned about very specifically. He said, if you start to offshore manufacturing, and that's what engineers will do, because engineers are there to solve a problem and optimize, you will lose the ability to innovate because the innovation is going to follow the manufacturing. The engineers are going to follow the manufacturing. The design is ultimately going to follow the manufacturing. And as a result, semiconductors is the quintessential example. There is no coherent explanation of what is going on in economic policy and with trade that should say we lose the ability to make semiconductors, and a rocky outcropping off the coast of China is the place where they should all be made.
And meanwhile, China slaps tariffs on NVIDIA this morning as a result of their presumed monopolistic activities. I want to keep this room and this conversation. No.
Why did they do that? They did it in response to Trump tariffs.
Microphone.
Okay. Oh.
So where the moderator is going to attempt to bring us back on track is tariffs as a tool for bringing out and bringing about the outcomes that we're hoping, that we all hope, I think that we all share, which is to strengthen the American economy and make sure that we continue to lead. So in a recent op-ed, Senator Gramm and his colleague Don Boudreaux wrote the following. This was in the Wall Street Journal. Each job created by recent tariffs on washing machines and steel has cost the U.S. economy an estimated $820,000 and $900,000 respectively, each job. Tariffs imposed in the name of revitalizing American manufacturing have, over 6 years, been followed by slightly decreased manufacturing output, reductions in the percentage of non-farm labor force employed in manufacturing, and significantly higher trade deficits. So this is a very damning observation. I believe the data does bear them out. How is it that tariffs, more of the same, will result in a different outcome, in your opinion?
Well, I think we have to distinguish between two kinds of tariffs. There are tariffs targeted at a specific country, which have one effect, and there are tariffs to protect the American market overall, which would have a very different effect. The tariffs that the Trump administration imposed, generally speaking, were targeted specifically at China. And what happens when you target a tariff specifically at China, you discourage production in China. That doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to run to produce in the United States instead. In fact, it means you might move your production to Vietnam or Mexico or anywhere else.
Mexico, most likely.
And that is exactly what happened. The Peterson Institute has produced some excellent charts showing what happened to imports from China in each category of goods as we imposed tariffs on them, because we did it on a rolling basis. And what you see is an immediate and dramatic effect on sourcing in China. And so those tariffs very effectively forced production out of China, reduced our reliance on China, which was their objective. But I think it's also true and perfectly fair to say, doing that isn't necessarily going to mean you create a bunch of jobs in the United States. If you do want manufacturing jobs in the United States, you have to make it relatively more attractive to produce in the United States relative to import into the United States. And that's where you hear the proposal that Trump has made more recently, what he calls the ring around the collar model. I would call it a bounded market that says you actually want a global tariff that simply makes it relatively more attractive to produce and purchase in the United States rather than from outside. And the last thing I would say just briefly about a lot of these econometric studies, which tend to sort of look at what happened in the 6 to 8 months after a tariff goes into effect. If you're trying to do an econometric study, that's what you have to do, right? You find the little change and come up with all sorts of clever methods to try to isolate the effect. The problem is that that's not how trade policy is actually going to work, right? It would be like if I said, well, what was the effect of free trade? Well, I'm just going to go measure and see how many factories closed in the 3 months after we did something. Economists would lose your mind if you tried to do that. They say that's not a good understanding of the actual equilibrium and long-run investment at all. And that's entirely fair. But the same goes for the converse. If we want to understand what actually trying to create incentives to restore American manufacturing will do, you're not going to find those in the first year. You're going to find those in the question of whether you actually get higher levels of investment, if you actually get more workforce training and development in those kinds of activities, and if over the course of 10 or 20 years, you actually start to see a pattern that creates those kinds of value.
I suspect, Phil, you want to talk a little bit about that.
Let me, first of all, this ring around the collar business. Let me first say that Trump imposed tariffs on all steel producers in the world. He moved to close the washing machine gap by taxing washing machines. And over an extended period of time, in looking at the cost of those tariffs, they have cost over 10 times what the jobs actually paid, which is a consistent factor in looking at protective tariffs. Now, let me talk about this ring around the collar business. Imposing an across-the-board tariff of 10 or 20%. Now, let's take Walmart. So basically what we're going to do, remember that about half of all our imports are component parts that go into American manufacturing. So as the president of Mexico said when President Trump was threatening a 25% tariff, if you want to shut down your automobile industry, go ahead and impose a tariff on Mexico. But let's just look at the across-the-board tariff. Let me just give you an example. My mama left a tenant farm to work in the Eagle and Phoenix mill 85 years ago. She worked in the mill for 3 years, and then she started working on a second shift in the hospital and became a nurse's aide and became a practical nurse. And then she spent 20 years eliminating 2 jobs in the Eagle and Phoenix mill, my brother's job and my job. And the mill went broke, not because, and we weren't denied a job when it went broke, we made it go broke by having better opportunities. Now, what this ring around the collar is in essence saying is, look, let's drive up the cost of all these cheap, let's just take clothing, sold in Walmart. And so maybe then we'll open up the Eagle and Phoenix mill. But who's going to go work in that mill? Are we going to bring back all these sewing machines and have people sewing, making shirts in America? It's a preposterous proposal. And how do you get jobs in America? Freedom and opportunity created jobs in America, not government planning, not a group of super smart people who decide that we're going to impose protective tariffs. What created America was opportunity and freedom. And if we want more jobs in America, we need to reduce regulatory burden, reduce taxes, and deal with the debt problem. That's the key. This idea that suddenly we're going to have people in government, these chosen people, Biden and Harris, perfect example of the thought leaders, that they're going to set policy that is going to rebuild America's industrial and production might. It's just preposterous. This is an old idea. It goes back to Plato. The Guardians, these smart young people like Oren, they were going to get together and they were going to make these decisions. We tried it for 2,500 years. It failed. Why do we have to do it again?
Well, and I'd like to have Oren, you respond to that, but tee up the response by saying that I do have a great deal of empathy for the senator's view that governments are lousy at picking winners and losers. They're great at picking cylinders. They're great at being influenced politically. And so the decision-making capacity of bureaucrats and those who are not close to the commercial process in understanding where industry is evolving is poor. So there's always an element in the tariff debate to picking winners and losers. How is it that you see the possibility of the application of tariffs winning a battle that, as the senator has just pointed out, seems to have been lost time and again over the last 5,000 years, is what you wrote in the op-ed, not 2,500 years?
I'm bringing it into the present.
Well, I'd be interested to know what the end date on that 5,000 years is, because, of course, the United States built its incredible free and opportunity-laden economy behind the world's highest tariffs. A tariff was the first bill passed by the first Congress and signed into law on July 4th by George Washington. The tariff was at the heart of Henry Clay's American system. Abraham Lincoln was a tariff man. Teddy Roosevelt was a tariff man. It's very interesting to read. Recently someone showed me Eisenhower's memoir. It has a wonderful page where he's explaining the decision to start opening up trade in the post World War II era and defending all of the ways that they only did this subject to very careful government scrutiny and evaluation of how we were still protecting American workers and industry. Reagan, of course, was called by the Cato Institute the greatest protectionist since Herbert Hoover. Reagan took repeated aggressive protectionist trade action against the Japanese in particular. And so this era of...
All true, Senator, all true.
Yeah, but I'm going to give you the rest of the story.
No,
All true, Oren. All true, Oren. Keep going.
Thank you. It's like being fact-checked in real time in a good way, which apparently I guess does make me the Kamala Harris of this discussion. The only time during which we've said, well, government can't handle trade policy, so we need to get out of it, is during this post-Cold War era in which government made an awful lot of policy decisions to reduce tariffs, picking winners and losers along the way, signing 5,000-page long trade agreements, often drafted by the relevant industry lobbyists. And the result of it was all of the negative impacts that we've been discussing. I do appreciate that we've moved on from claiming industry doesn't need rebuilding to claiming that government will fail to rebuild industry. But there actually isn't any reason to believe that. I agree entirely with all of the ways that government will do a bad and imperfect job. It is one of the things that leads me to prefer something like a 10% universal tariff over let's find which specific industries we do or don't care about. But I think it's a real categorical mistake to envision free trade as is practiced in this economy as the absence of government and the one thing we can get right, and actually protecting the American market as the thing government isn't capable of. In fact, the history is exactly the opposite. And the last thing I wanted to pick up on just briefly is this question of, okay, well, what would we bring back? Are we bringing back these textile jobs and sewing machines? And the answer is, of course not. It's very funny. You get two objections to what I'm talking about. One is, are we bringing back all of these sewing machines? The other is, well, why bother doing this in the highly advanced automated factories we would have in the U.S.? You won't have a lot of jobs. And it's the latter that I'm talking about. When we reshore manufacturing to this country, and to the extent we have started to do it, you look at the TSMC factory making the cutting-edge semiconductors in Arizona, already producing higher yields than their best fabs in Taiwan. We're not bringing back sewing machines. We're building highly, highly productive, capital-intensive, low-labor factories. But what we're comparing that to is not how many people the textile mill employed 80 years ago. What we're comparing that to is the 0 people we employ in our deindustrialized sector today. And so what we should be envisioning for the future is, if you think about how we came off of our trajectory of industrial growth beginning around 2000, what would it like to get back on it? What would it look like if productivity in this sector had been growing at 3% per year, as it did in prior eras? What would it look like if we did have 17 million people working in manufacturing? Those would be highly, highly productive, high-wage jobs, producing roughly the additional $1 trillion of output that we have given away as our trade deficit has skyrocketed.
Thank you, Oren. And Phil, Phil has the last remark before we open it up to the room.
Okay. So first of all, everything Oren said about tariffs is totally wrong, okay? And so let me give you a quick view through history. When the modern state evolved in Europe, the first thing it did was get control of its borders. It had trouble collecting revenues, and so it imposed protective tariffs. In the 17th and 1800s, tariffs were the major source of government revenue. We did not have the highest tariffs in the world. The lowest tariffs in the world were in Britain because they repealed the Corn Laws in 1840. They imposed under Peel an income tax, and Britain had the lowest tariffs in the world by far when the Industrial Revolution reached its peak in Great Britain, and they were the richest country in the world. We had no ability to impose an income tax under the Articles of Confederation or under the Constitution. Tariffs paid for 90% of American government. Alexander Hamilton was very concerned about high tariffs because, one, you don't collect revenues on goods that aren't imported. Two, it promoted smuggling where no tariffs were paid. And three, even though Alexander Hamilton wanted to use bonuses to encourage technology, he was concerned that high tariffs would subsidize inefficiency. Now, we reached an all-time tariff in 1828, the Tariff of Abominations, which brought calamity to the Whig Party. And for 30 years, we cut protective tariffs by 73%. In 1859, we had a 15.6% tariff, which was one of the lowest tariffs on the face of the earth. Then tariffs were raised to fund the Civil War, and then for 20 years we cut tariffs. And then tariffs were raised, you had a cataclysm politically, and then tariffs were cut again, okay? Now, when tariffs were falling, industrial production in America grew on average by 6.4%. When tariffs were rising, it grew by 4%. So you can argue anything you want to argue. You cannot argue that high tariffs created the American miracle. The American miracle was caused by freedom. Americans were the freest people on the face of the earth, and they responded to it. Now, let me talk about Reagan. I was there. We were writing the Reagan budget. I saw the president at least once a week during this whole debate. The mythology is that Reagan was a protectionist and that he imposed these voluntary restraints on Japan. The reality is Reagan hated that program. There was not one member of the cabinet in the Reagan administration that made the argument that voluntary restraints were good policy. Not one. Well, so what was the argument for them? Congress had just bailed out Chrysler, and the argument was if you don't do something using your executive authority, you're going to have a tariff bill passed, and it's going to be there permanently. So Reagan hated it, but he put in a voluntary restraint program 4 years that went up every year, and Congress did not pass a protective tariff. We also had one additional protectionist measure, and that is in doing the Reagan program, we had a very close vote coming. So the Louisiana delegation came to me and said, we will vote with you on every amendment on the Reagan program if you will get the president to commit that you won't go after the sugar program. Now, the sugar program is theft. Americans pay twice as much for sugar as anybody in the world, so 4,100 people can get a great big check from the government. That's protectionism. The root of protectionism is special interest. Now, so we looked at it hard. We thought it was going to be a close vote, and we were afraid that we would lose it on some amendment, so we cut the deal. So Reagan turned to me and said, I guess this is what they call kissing the pig. So to say that Ronald Reagan was a protectionist when the man in his final statement talked about the city on the hill with the gates open and with a free harbor, is such a violation of the facts. Anyway, I
Japanese
take it
car
personally.
imports definitely fell in the next 2 years, though. Oren, I'd just like to see a show of hands who would like to ask a question. So I have Osley, I have Rob, I have Ranji. So I'm going to start passing the mic, unless Oren, you wanted to respond to the senator on that.
No, let's move on. I think just to let everyone know, this will be an American Compass podcast episode as well. So just be aware when you're asking your question,
please.
Your voice will be projected to the earbuds of the world.
Exactly. So I'm going to start with Ranji Nagaswamy, and Ranji, you can introduce yourself.
Ranji Nagaswamy, a friend of Terry, FOT, like most of us in the room, but founder of the Finance Leaders Fellowship program at the Aspen Institute. It is an amazing conversation about the how, and you're both disagreeing rather articulately about how one brings back jobs to America. I actually am very unclear if that happens under either proposal. So if the outcome is to restore manufacturing jobs in America, or in you're saying let's bring back the higher end where productivity will be so amazing, the jobs, we're not going back to 25 million anytime soon. And Senator, deregulation, these tried and true conservative principles take a really long time.
See, I don't agree that the jobs left. There's no unemployment in America.
Just manufacturing jobs.
Well,
The 25 to 11 to 13 million numbers quoted here. If I may,
Okay.
What happens to the average American who voted for Trump in droves, believing that these policies will bring back their jobs?
I'll answer too.
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that tariffs are one piece of a much broader program. One thing that I find to be a really striking contrast, and this speaks to an element of the Biden agenda that was bipartisan in Congress when it comes to the so-called CHIPS Act on semiconductors in particular, is you look at the standard sort of freedom agenda of we're going to cut taxes and whatever flowers will bloom. And we now have the track record after they did that at the end of 2017. And, Kevin Hassett, who at the time was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, went to the American Economic Association at the beginning of 2019 and showed these wonderful charts on how, based on what they had expected to happen with investment as a share of GDP, with growth, et cetera, the tax cuts were working exactly as expected. And unfortunately, he was using preliminary data because he was so excited to put it up on the charts. And when you update his own metrics with the actual final data, you find the effect was zero, or in fact negative. Now, the CHIPS Act, by contrast, has led to roughly a quadrupling in the rate of investment in the electronic segment of the manufacturing sector. So it turns out that when we actually focus our policy on boosting manufacturing, instead of just giving tax cuts broadly, we do see effects. And I think if we have a broad-based policy that both continues to make proactive investments in building up industry in this country, and pair that with tariffs that actually create the incentives to buy the things that are produced in this country, I think we'll start to see an uptick, certainly over the next 4 years. 4 years. I don't think we will solve the problem in 4 years. It took us 25 years to dig this hole. And so the correct question is, what is the right set of policies that are going to get us where we need to be 25 years from now? But the direction I think those policies have to take is actually saying that manufacturing matters and making sure our economic policy is oriented toward that.
Well, let me respond by saying that the deregulatory policy and tax cuts did work, and they did work permanently. Per capita income rose, income of virtually every group in the country grew faster than it had grown in 30 years, mostly, in my opinion, because of the effectiveness of cutting corporate tax rates. We then had the pandemic, which messed all the statistics up. And we had the protective tariff, which reduced economic growth in 2019. Trump set out the tariff to achieve three goals: reduce the trade deficit exploded; to increase employment and manufacturing, it declined, and the only measure that is meaningful is as a percentage of the total labor force, and that somehow this was going to promote prosperity. So what am I afraid is going to happen? I believe that deregulatory policy will be effective. I think passing the tax cut is going to be very difficult, but I think it can be beneficial. But I think protective tariffs are going to have a negative impact on the economy and could offset the impact of the other policy. Now, let me just say something about this wonderful CHIP Act. If you pay people to spend your money, they will spend it, okay? So there's no doubt about the fact that if you go out and you give people $45 billion to spend, they're going to spend it, okay? I don't disagree with that. But now let's look at where we are. The best estimate we have by the company that is the world's greatest producer of high-tech chips and that is making one of these investments is that the chips that will be produced in Arizona will only be 50% more expensive than the same chip produced in Taiwan. Okay? So what do you think is going to happen? You think government is going to say, Jesus Christ, we screwed up? No. They're going to impose a protective tariff on chips. And then with companies that are using these chips to produce goods, they're not going to be competitive in selling those goods because of the chips. So what do you think they're going to do? They're going to impose a protective tariff on the products that use chips. Okay? So where does all this lead? It all leads to lower growth, less prosperity. And again, all of this goes back. You know, the right has gone so far around their left now. This is all industrial policy. Who is going to decide what jobs are to be protected? Who has the right to tell me how to spend my money? Am I not a free person? Does government have the right to make me buy something so that somebody else can produce it when there's no national security argument to it? Not in the country I grew up in. And again, this all goes back to the idea that if you turn economic policy over to a small group of really smart people, that capitalism is random. You know, hell, people don't know what they're doing. And these very smart people, we call them guardians, or Plato did, that they will make these decisions for us. And if it hadn't been tried for so many years, you could say, damn, this is exciting. But the problem is it's been tried and it's been rejected over and over and over again. Got it.
So let's shorten up answers. I know Rob Brown and then Osley, and there's probably a few more. So Rob Brown is next with the mic.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you both for being here today. I'm Rob Brown. I am Terry's business partner, which is a privilege. I also spent most of the front half of my career as an economist. So I got a couple things I can't help myself from saying. One is, Senator, you're absolutely right. The corn laws were repealed, and productivity went up. I think it's really important to remember why the corn laws were repealed, because they weren't just the corn laws, they covered all grain, and there were people starving in Ireland. Right, and the reason the UK government repealed the law was to enable trade so that they could get food to the people who needed it in Ireland. And let's not forget that as an example of history. I've got a picture on my wall of Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill having a beer on St. Patrick's Day. So I also want to thank you, all three of you, for reminding us what civil disagreement is. It's very much appreciated in this day and age, and I hope you set the example for everyone in this room and the rest of the world. But that's not what I wanted to say. The idea that jobs growth in the aggregate is such and such, or the idea that total factor productivity has gone up or down because different parts of productivity have gone up or down, are all facts that you guys have cited. I think what's really important to remember, though, is that when we had the displacement of jobs in agriculture, and I'm not the first one to make this observation, of course, but those jobs migrated north because if you were working on a farm, you could pretty much work in a factory, right? If you were working on a farm and you knew how farm tools were put together, you could put together the parts of an automobile. That premise does not hold when you're thinking about labor in the United States today, because you've got a skills mismatch. So the question is, how do you deal with that skills mismatch, right? You certainly could say, Senator, as you did, that the manufacturing job of today is for people who are programmers, but not everybody can be a programmer, right? So we've got a real problem in the United States where we've got to shift to low quality jobs, low paying jobs, low productivity jobs in the services sector, and there's nothing to replace them currently. So I would like to ask both of you, what do we do with that mismatch? How do we handle that?
And Oren, let's start with you, because it might be more your wheelhouse.
Sure, I really appreciate the point about agriculture to manufacturing, because it's a point I've made myself slightly differently in the past, and I think it's really important that when we celebrate the de-agriculturalization, I'm sure that's not a word, of the economy, sure, it's very sophisticated. We celebrate it because there were jobs for people to move into. If I told you that the story of the mechanization of agriculture was that we eliminated all the jobs in farms and all that was left was digging mud for some reason, we wouldn't actually have seen the economic progress. The economic progress was not the mechanization of agriculture alone. It was that combined with the creation of new and better jobs for people to move into. And so it's really important to hold our economy accountable, not just for the productivity gains on what we are already doing, but the creation of those new things as well. I do think that is one of the reasons that manufacturing matters, but I think it's important to view that through a wide lens, not just that we need more jobs in factories per se, but that factories, even if they have relatively fewer jobs in them, and those are hopefully much higher productivity jobs, are also the anchors of local economies because they produce tradable goods, right? Every local economy needs to be making something the rest of the world wants for everything it wants from the rest of the world. Everyone can't just cut each other's hair. Because those tend to be higher productivity jobs, and because manufacturing is where you get a lot of the productivity gains, it supports higher prosperity for everybody else. Again, people don't actually cut hair faster than they did 500 years ago. So why can somebody earn 20 times as much? Well, that's fair. It's because the people whose hair they're cutting are so much more productive. Mm-hmm. And then where you have that activity, you don't just have the manufacturing, you have the supply chains, you have the logistics, you have all the accompanying services, and you have that activity almost by definition, because it's happening in the physical economy, distributed much more broadly across the country instead of concentrated in a few segments. And so I think it's an important point for us to think about broadly, that when we want to see abstract things like growth in the economy, one of the places where we went very wrong, and where free trade economics in particular goes very wrong, is just taking that GDP growth percentage as the one true figure. And as long as that's going up enough, we're all doing well. When in fact, what kind of growth, growth for who, growth allocated how, are all incredibly important questions that the let's send all the manufacturing to China model just misses.
Well, first of all, I don't live in New York. I come here to visit every once in a while. I have a son who's stupid enough to live here and pay the taxes. But every business in my state has a help wanted sign in it. And to listen to this debate, you would get this idea that there are no jobs in America. There are no workers in America. The bottom quintile of able-bodied work-age persons who actually work is 36%, down from 68% when we pass a war on poverty. So this idea that America is starving for jobs, desperate, we've got to create jobs, is preposterous. Secondly, to answer your question, we have a problem in education. There's a government monopoly, and as tends to happen with government monopolies, the education in America today, public education, primary and secondary, is run for the benefit of the people who run the schools. And I'm not saying school choice is the be-all and end-all of this earth, and there may be something better, but it is the one thing that is proving across the country to be more effective. And human capital is as important as physical capital. And I think revitalizing American education is critical. But please remember this, and all these discussions of how things are going to hell in a handbasket and been going to hell for some time. Today, 66.1% of American households have incomes that 50 years ago would have put them in the top quintile. Okay, so this deprivation, this nation in decline, is a myth, like so many other myths. And again, who decides what is to be produced? Oren and many other people now say, well, you got to have knowledgeable people make these decisions. But under our system, where we have flourished above all people on earth, has been a system where the person who earns the income with the sweat of their brow gets to decide how to spend it.
Last question for the lady.
Yes,
And then
thank
some
you.
Summary remarks.
Okay. My name is Asli Karahan. I'm the principal at Lioness Capital. Worked with Graham and Terry for more than a decade at UBS and other places. So happy to be here. So we heard some very interesting, some not so sensical comments on economic impact of jobs and tariffs. But I think we missed the most important part here that has moved American body politic in the last 10 years or so, which is national security. I think you mentioned the words 2 times, but we really didn't dwell into it. I don't think personally, I don't have any fetish about manufacturing jobs. Who knows what jobs is right, a free economy, the demand in American economy, and the American consumers will decide. I don't pretend to know, and I don't have the hubris to decide what is right for the American economy. But what I'm very worried about an American citizen is our dependence on China on issues like, for example, the fact that 75% of our pharmaceutical ingredients are produced in China. We are dependent on them, and I do not want the CCP to have any leverage on my populace. TSMC is a good example. Chips are a good example, not because there's anything sacred about chips, it's because they are the key ingredient of our military superiority about China. That's why I care about chips. And there are other things I care about. We can go down the list. So let's forget about the economic arguments. I think that's a rabbit hole. Let's talk about how we're going to reduce our dependence on China so that they do not have any leverage on us, given the fact that we are in a very adversarial position, and given the fact that they're leading an axis against us.
Well, I'll start. I think, first of all, we've got to decide how we're going to deal with China. Much of the thinking about it is based on the logic of how we dealt with the Soviet Union. You literally have a school of thought in Washington that's close to a majority that believes that we should just isolate China. The problem is Soviet Union never had an economy. China has a massive economy. We can't isolate China. So we've got to decide, it seems to me, is our national security threatened by cheap lawn furniture at Walmart or cheap shirts? And I don't know of a machine that makes a shirt, by the way. They're made with sewing machines. And we need to narrow down what we're trying to do. But you need to be aware that national defense argument for protectionism is the most abused argument. We have the Jones Act today, which was a national defense argument whereby you have to use American ships and crews, and it has been devastating to the economy, lowered our defense readiness, hurt Puerto Rico and Hawaii, where you bring oil here from Saudi Arabia rather than Texas because it's cheaper to ship it because of the Jones Act. So all I'm saying is, let's come up with a rational program that's based on logic and not some slogan. And then I'm ready to look at it and be supportive of it.
Oren.
Well, a rational program based on logic sounds like something that's going to need a lot of smart young people to figure out.
Well, this is the exception.
Well, exactly. The reality is that one reason I don't focus so much on the national security exception is because it takes 10 seconds to then get back to this, which is, yes, I guess you could try to very narrowly have a lot of bureaucrats aggressively lobbied for what is and what is not national security. But first of all, I think that sounds a lot worse than a general orientation toward supporting industrial strength, which would have the benefits we're looking for. But secondly, I think one thing we're seeing is it's actually incredibly difficult to try to identify a defense industrial base independent of just an industrial base. And it's telling, for instance, that the first place you went was pharmaceuticals, which I think is a fantastic example, but not something you would, it doesn't, certainly not a Department of Defense question. And so when you start to ask, what do we actually need to be good at in this country to preserve our national security, what we actually need is a healthy industrial economy, commons, and industrial base with a strong workforce pipeline, with high levels of innovation. Because if you don't do that, what you end up trying to do is saying, how are we just going to maintain enough supply chain in missile parts so that we could scale it up really quickly if we need to? Well, good luck. You're not going to do that unless you actually have industry that makes, for all sorts of other consumer reasons, the same things that you would need for missiles, or at least has the same kinds of factories and skills and machine tools that you can use for what you need, right? And when we scaled up for World War II, our GDP was a good measure of our defense capacity because auto factories could also make tanks. Now we just have a lot of massage parlors, which also counts as GDP, and that's great, but it is worthless when we actually talk about things that we care about in the national security space. So ultimately, I agree with you, but I think both from a sort of political economy perspective, what can we trust policymakers to do, we are better off with the broader lens. And from a practical question about industry, we're better off from a broader lens. The last thing I just want to say quickly about China, because it connects to a point the senators made several times about just sort of the importance of freedom and people being free to choose what to buy and sell, is that we have a very serious problem with China, which is that China is not a free country where people are free to choose what to buy and sell. And so whereas we like to think in our minds that free markets and free trade go together, if you're for free markets, you should be for free trade. The reality is that when your definition of free trade means integrating our market with the Chinese one, you're not promoting free markets. You're actually inhibiting them, because you're now saying anything that I want to do as a business person in the United States is frankly subject to the whims of the Chinese Communist Party if they want to subsidize somebody there doing it and wipe me out. And so I embrace fully the same principle that the senator is speaking about, that we should want that freedom and opportunity to the greatest extent possible. I just don't think integrating our economy with China is the way to do that. I think the bounded market model that says, actually, a lot of these countries are not playing by these rules, we need to preserve that space within our country, is the one that is much more faithful to our tradition, to conservatism, and to actually advancing free markets.
Pretty clear how consequential the tariff debate is, given that it covers national security, workforce training, and any number of elements of how we're going to make America first again. There was one topic we did not cover this morning that I just wanted to mention in closing, before thanking Oren and the senator for being here and you all. And that is that tariffs as a revenue producer are sometimes overstated. Last year, the United States federal government took in $80 billion of tariffs versus the $4.5 trillion that they took in overall in terms of revenues. So that's less than 2% of federal revenue.
And spent more than that.
Oh, I was going to finish.
Farm subsidy. Oh,
no,
you're
stop.
Go ahead.
Our deficit overall was still 1.8 trillion. So,
but they spent as much as they took in subsidizing agriculture to help them deal with retaliation their policy caused.
Can everybody join me in just thanking the good Lord that this 83-year-old man still has a voice? And can you also join me in thanking Oren Cass and his colleagues at American Compass for developing such a clear and important message, drawing attention to the forgotten parts of America, which certainly helped get the president elected. I honestly believe, Oren, that your work and the work of your colleagues at American Compass is essential, and I'm very grateful for it.
Well,
for those of you who want to know more about American Compass, you can visit their website. So a round of applause as well for Oren.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Terry.